So, whoa. I'm sitting on like a stool, which is why it's a little wobbly. Welcome back to the second installment of Brutally Honest Career Chats. We have a special guest today, Honey. I wanted to do this because there were so many questions that I didn't get to answer in my last video. I'm gonna link my first Q&A down below in the description, but that is about it. And I'm just gonna go ahead and start answering some questions. So this is the first question. In my last video, I talked a lot about my experience and what ended up getting me a job at Google. But I realized a really important aspect of actually getting that interview is having a good resume. And that's something that when I was in college, I was so confused about. It was my first time having to write a resume. I didn't know what a good resume looked like. And I also just didn't have a good benchmark. I think it really helps to have something visual to look at. So I'm just gonna put my resume in college up here. This is ultimately the end form of my resume that I came up with after trial and error for many years. But I think the pillars of a good tech resume, first of all, experience. I know some people might be like, I've never had an internship and I've never had a job before, so what experience can I actually list? I was in that same dilemma for my first 2 years of college. What I ended up doing, and what a lot of people end up doing if they don't have concrete work experience, is you have to work on projects. I did hackathons, I took classes, I basically built up this portfolio of different projects that I had worked on and could also talk about during my interviews. Even if you're not in college and you don't have explicit opportunities to work on something, I think coding is nice because there's really no cost of starting up. So if you wanted to build an app, you could totally use all these different frameworks. You can use React Native, Firebase, anything. All of these are free and you can build something from scratch by yourself. I think the next pillar or important aspect that you should have in your resume, I think this is just generally for any resume that you make, but you want to use active keywords when describing what you do. Things that demonstrate leadership, initiative, drive, impact. The other thing is if there's any way to get metrics for any projects or work experience that you do have, definitely include that. I think for me, since I had work experience, but they weren't always finished work experiences, I didn't include that many numbers. But any opportunity there was to demonstrate a new skill, I would make sure that I'm just gonna put some keywords that are good to use when building a resume right here. In my resumes, I always put my technical skills and sometimes my non-technical skills at the very bottom. I feel like that's a very non-intrusive way of telling people I can do this and that without taking too much space. So for good skills to include, I would say any coding languages would be good to put on a tech resume. I would also include the level of proficiency. So I worked a lot with Java when I was in college, and so I would always put Java and then parentheses proficient. But then there were things that I'd worked with, you know, a couple years prior, something like this 3D design software. I didn't have that much experience with it, so I would not say like I'm proficient in this, but I would just put something like intermediate or beginner. And then outside of that, I would also have different rows for other skills that I have, like language skills, interests, hobbies, things like that. And the reason I included that is because sometimes during the interview, an interviewer will bring it up because they'll be like, oh, I saw your resume and I saw you like art or graphic design. Like, tell me a little bit about that. And I think that just adds more character to who you are. And then one aspect I think doesn't get emphasized enough is the visuals of a resume actually matter. So when I was in college, I was told very often that a recruiter only looks at your resume for 5 to 10 seconds. And so the way that I always like to approach this is I would just have one color that I would just use in the resume as like a theme. I chose orange. Obviously you don't want your entire resume to be orange, but you can definitely highlight different aspects with color. You can also bold and italicize your resume. You can do really different cool things. I had a design resume separately for any like design projects that I worked on, and I took a lot more like creative liberty in making that look cute and nice and things like that. So yeah, don't be afraid to play around with your resume visually, and I think it definitely always helps to have a visually appealing resume. But that is kind of my advice for crafting your resume. Next question is actually about startups. I mentioned this in my last video, but I did have an experience working at a startup, a very early stage startup when I was in college. Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of startups and that culture because I haven't been fully integrated into that lifestyle. but I can talk a little bit about my experience and potentially answer this question about how you can find a job at a startup. So if you're interested in working at a startup, I think you are in luck because startups have been hotter than ever. I feel like there's just a new startup popping up every single minute of the day. I think AngelList is a great place to start for that. AngelList is basically this website with a ton of startups and information about the startups. The great thing about it is it's usually pretty transparent on compensation, equity, location, and the kind of work that you'll be doing. On AngelList, I also think you can filter by company size, industry, things like that. The other resource that I've noticed, even during college before I had a full-time job, it's actually pretty crucial to have your LinkedIn updated with your experience, and if you can go into detail about things that you do, that always helps because there's an entire network of people who are using LinkedIn to seek out new software engineers or PMs or designers and things like that. I get emails and DMs and everything on LinkedIn pretty frequently, and at this point I just don't even open it because I have so many in my inbox. And this happens if you are just generally a computer science student or you work for a tech company. And then the third thing that I've heard that can be successful is networking virtually, and I've heard there's actually a pretty high success rate with this. So if there's a company that you're interested in, you can go on to LinkedIn, find a recruiter or someone that works in HR, connect with them, and then shoot them a DM being like, hey, I'm interested in your company. I really wanted to see what the interview process is like, and I was wondering if you could loop me into that. I've had friends who have done that in the past and it worked out for them. But another question that I got asked was just generally about my experience at startups. And I did want to kind of touch on working at a big and established company versus working at a smaller startup. So I think one of the main differences from my understanding as someone who hasn't actually worked at a startup for a long time is that working at a startup requires you to wear multiple hats. On top of being a software engineer, there are times that you will be roped into doing something else that is potentially not software engineering related. So you might be operating as more of a PM sometimes. You might be coordinating with marketing if the marketing team needs someone to give a presentation. So there are a lot of responsibilities that you assume in a startup that you might otherwise not have had at a bigger company. One of my friends who works in a startup, he was kind of telling me all the different things that he had to do that he never thought he would have to do as a software engineer. As an example, one of them he was telling me was recruiting. Since the company isn't that big yet and their focus has been on building the product for the last couple of years, they just don't have a very strong recruiting team or even an HR department. So when it came time to growing the company and having to expand and things like that, because there's such limited number of engineers even, my friend had to do so much of the recruiting and interviewing and coordinating with people that he didn't think that you'd have to do. But that's kind of the first difference in what it's like working at a startup and if a company. Obviously in terms of commitment, passion, and things like that, I think to work at a startup very successful, you have to be very passionate about the product. Whereas to work at a bigger company, you don't necessarily need to be passionate about the project. You just gotta do the things on your agenda, finish through, and then kind of close out for the day. This is not necessarily true of every single startup, but I've just noticed that typically people who work in startups work longer hours and are much more involved in building the product. But the upside of that is that you get a great opportunity to help build something from the ground up. And in addition to being a great work experience, that also has a lot of upside in company growth, work opportunities, being able to move up in leadership roles and things like that, and also potentially equity increases as you grow. That's kind of my understanding. I feel like I have other opinions at startup, but I don't want to get too deep into this just because I know there are other questions. The next question that I think a lot of people had, just regarding Google in general, is how much I get paid. From my understanding, at a big tech company, the compensation is usually broken up into three aspects. So one is the base salary, which is what you'll be earning in a year. The next is equity, and if you're working for an established company that has already IPO'd, then you're probably just gonna get stock units. And this is usually granted on a 4-year schedule, which means that a quarter of the amount that they give you is going to be granted at the first year, second year, third year, fourth year mark. And then the third part of your compensation package is usually a bonus. And by bonus, this can mean anything from a sign-on bonus, a relocation bonus, I don't know if they call it a bonus, and a target bonus. Hello, it is Editing Sarah. kind of late. It's like 2 a.m. right now, but I realized I didn't explain my compensation very well, so I'm just gonna hop on and try to explain it right now. Let me pull up levels.fy because I think it's pretty accurate in terms of compensation for employees across different companies. For reference, I'm at the L4 level right now, but I will say my compensation is below this. So maybe I'm being underpaid, I don't know. I started off as an L3 in 2019, and I'd say my total comp back then was 30K less than this. I believe I had the standard package when I started off, so something like 120K base, 25K stock a year, and then the bonus would be somewhere around like 16 to 18K. But in terms of L4, I think the numbers are pretty accurate here except for stock. Stock is definitely variable depending on the person because I know it's negotiable. I haven't really negotiated this number, and so maybe that's why my total comp is a little bit lower, but I hope that kind of explains how much software engineers get paid at companies like Google. I would say levels.fy is a great place to reference if you're ever curious, but definitely take it with a grain of salt. So yeah. In terms of negotiating, I did get a question about this. I don't know if you guys can hear the constant banging noise. I don't know what construction is happening outside to warrant this, but it's kind of loud. So in terms of negotiating, I actually am really bad at negotiations, but I have friends who have done it successfully, so here are some tips that I've derived from them. When I was in college and I had gotten all these full-time offers, I tried to negotiate, but I didn't have anything better than my Google offer at that time in terms of explicit compensation. So I did have this offer from a different company, and they were granting me a lot of stock, but they were a startup and their stock didn't have value essentially at that point because they were pre-IPO. So when you approach negotiation, I think it's really important to, one, know what the standard for this job function is. So by this I mean doing your research and due diligence with getting the right numbers. There are a lot of websites where you can get a good sense of what you should be getting and the type of offer that a company should provide for you. So levels.fyi is the first one that I can think of. I think this website is great because people are able to anonymously post how much they earn in a year. So if you're ever curious what like an L6, L7 earns at Google, you can just go on and filter by L6, L7, filter by the company Google, and it will just tell you what people are earning. I think there are numbers for a ton of different companies, like smaller companies, even startups and things like that, so highly recommend that. The second is Glassdoor. I feel like Glassdoor is a little bit more outdated, but I still use it sometimes if there isn't a lot of information on a company, and Glassdoor just has a broader scope in terms of information about the culture, ratings for like the company itself and like the CEO, ratings for the interview process and how hard it was. So I would definitely reference those two resources before you approach negotiating or talking about compensation with a recruiter. But when it actually comes to negotiating, I've heard success stories from my friends who have, one, used counter offers. I think that's the primary way that you can negotiate an offer, which is you should have an offer that exceeds the amount that this company is giving you. So there's two ways of looking at it. You could ask for something specifically. You can say, for example, this company is offering me 200K in stock units. Would you be able to match that? And that would be you narrowing in on a specific form of compensation. The other way is you can just very broadly give the recruiter this competing offer and ask them to increase the total compensation and see what they can do. This kind of gives them more liberty to increase, for example, sign-on bonus if they just want to give you a one-time increase. One of my friends actually got an offer from a smaller startup. They were giving 250K in stock units, and so they brought their offer to Google, and Google was able to not only increase their salary, so their salary went from something like 115 to 125, but they also increased the amount of stock. The second way, which I've seen my friends do, is not having a counter offer, but presenting a good argument. I had a friend once that just emailed the company that they were planning to join, and they said, here are the reasons why I think I should be earning more. She told me that she basically pulled up a lot of numbers on what other females in tech were earning, basically drove the point that I am a valuable asset to your company and I would like to be earning as much as these other people within this field. And then the third way that I've seen this being done is one of my friends didn't have any other offers on hand. They got a pretty good offer at a company actually, but they essentially just asked. They were like, I wanted to see if you guys could increase my compensation. And usually if you want to negotiate, there's something that you should offer to them in order for them to offer something back to you, if that makes sense. The way that my friend spun it was, she was like, if you increase my offer to this amount, I will sign today. And I think the reason that was appealing to the company is because typically the company gives you like a couple of weeks to decide on whether or not you want to take an offer. And in that time span, there's the potential that another offer might come up. There's another company that you might be interviewing for, or you might still be in the loop for other companies. This might not work for all companies, but I think sometimes if a company really wants you to join, they will use this as a tactic where they will offer you a bonus or offer you an increase in stock or salary just to get you to sign day of. I don't think a lot of companies do that unless you ask for it, but you can definitely use that as like a negotiation tactic. I've been talking for a lot again, so I just wanted to do a speed round, and there's one topic that I really wanted to talk about today, but I think I'm just gonna put it to the next video, which is about being a woman in STEM. But for now, let's just do some speed round questions because I also have to go to brunch in like 10 minutes. So here we go. First question is whether or not I work a lot with project managers for my projects. I mentioned UX and product owners, PMs, but not project managers. So yes, I think project managers have different functions in different companies. In my first team, I actually didn't have any project manager that I was working with, so it was mostly PM and UX. In this new team, I also don't have a direct project manager, but they just onboarded someone, so I'm really excited to be working with I'm really excited to be working with them. But from my understanding, a project manager really handles, a lot of making my life easier, because right now if I were to do like a design review or try to coordinate with other teams, I would have to do all of that myself. But the project manager comes in and helps to make sure that the timeline is smooth and that I can talk to whoever I need to at the right moment and present what I need to in the right meetings and ensure that there is direction in a project. Next question is, do you think it is ever too late to start learning how to code? I've been working for a few years and want to consider getting into coding. It's never too late. I feel like coding is such an available skill to learn. Like at any point in your life, you can pick up coding and take a boot camp, for example. I mentioned boot camps, I think, in my last video, but boot camps are such a great way to focus in on learning how to code, build projects, and then be able to execute and find a job. So if your intention is from a professional perspective, trying to move into a software engineering job, I kind of recommend boot camps because they take less than the amount of time you would take learning how to code in, an undergrad or grad experience. And sometimes they pay off by themselves. So I know there are boot camps where the entire boot camp is free until you get a job. So if you don't get a job, then you don't ever have to pay them back. And I think that's a great financial trade-off because the bootcamp essentially helps you get to maybe a higher level in your financial status. And so you would be able to pay back this debt only when you achieve that goal of yours. And if you don't achieve it, then you don't have to worry about this debt. So it's never too late to learn. I think anyone can really pick up coding if you really tried. There's so many resources, especially with the internet nowadays. There are so many websites that offer free courses. You can use YouTube as a resource even just to look up tutorials on how to code. And I just think coding is a great skill. You can pick it up anytime. If you could do anything, what would it be? Hello, Shaheem. He's one of my friends. I would own a bakery. I don't know why. I've just always had this idea of having a little cute, quaint coffee shop or bakery. And I would just love to relish in that environment. I feel like I'm a pretty chill person, so I don't like that much stress, and sometimes being in a corporate environment gives me more stress than I would want. Obviously starting a bakery isn't easy peasy and no stress at all, but also I love baked goods and drinks, so I don't know, maybe a coffee shop one day would be good. How do you stay motivated? I get this question sometimes when I talk about doing YouTube and working a full-time job. It's really hard to stay motivated, I'll be honest. There are periods in my YouTube channel where I stop posting for a week or 2 or 3 weeks. And the reason is time management is still something that I'm working on. But I find that it's important for me to take breaks when I need it. Because otherwise, if I'm always on drive, I just don't do anything well. So whenever I feel like I'm really stressed and I can't do it and, I kind of get into this funk of, being unmotivated, I'll just take a day off. Mental health days exist. You should definitely do it if you need one. And taking a day off might just mean on the weekends, instead of filming something, I just decide to spend it with people I care about. The second way is kind of staying organized. I have a schedule now, and I feel like I like listing things in my Google Calendar so I know what I'm going to be doing every single day, and that just makes sure that I'm on the right track and that I'm fulfilling my goals for every single day. And it sounds a lot more productive than it actually is. Sometimes I just like don't follow my schedule, but I think having like a clear schedule helps me stay motivated. And then the last thing I think is just spending time with people that care about me and that I care about. I found out that if I hang around people that I care about and that care about me, it puts me in a much better mood. And I think my mood kind of dictates how well I do everything. When I'm unmotivated and lonely, that's even worse than if I'm just unmotivated. So yeah, that kind of is how I handle all that. So that's gonna be the last question for this Q&A. I know there are still a ton of questions that I haven't answered yet, so stay tuned for the next installment of this series. But that was the video for today, and I hope you guys are safe and well. And if you have any questions, definitely leave it down below, and I will catch you guys next time. Peace.